February 17th, 1990. This is Francis Lomas Feldman interviewing Maurice B. Hamovitch in his office at the School of Social Work, University of Southern California. The purpose of the interview is to have a rundown and some analysis when you feel you would like to be analytic about your experiences in the field of social work in California, but not restricted to California. So why don't we start with how you entered the field of social work and why?
I remember very clearly when and how and why, and with a little bit of embarrassment. I had 3 majors as an undergraduate at Queen's University in Canada. One was political science and economics, another was psychology and philosophy, and the third was English. And mainly my major was psychology, and I was interested in going on with that, except that in late 1930s, the only psychology that was taught that was at all clinical was working with rats in mazes, and I had great difficulty working with those little rats.
You didn't think you could affect their behavior?
Well, it wasn't. I didn't even care. I didn't care whether I did or I didn't. And I remember going to the psychology instructor and asking him, was there some place where in graduate work, where I could do some work with people, not work with rats. And Kurt Lewin had a program in Philadelphia, I guess it was, but it was still mainly, so it was more social psychology than clinical psychology. And he said, there's a profession called social work. Why don't you look into that? That sounds like it would be perfect for you, what you have in mind. I said, social work, what is that? I guess I was just entering my senior year. I was 19 at the time. And he said, well, it used to be dominated by women, but now there are some men going into the field, and it's growing, and look into it anyway. I was very reluctant, but I did. And I checked around and found that there was one at McGill University, and there were, in fact, 1 or 2 male graduates whom I interviewed. And they said, oh, yes, it's a growing field. It's one that you should go into. So I had an interview with Dorothy King, who was the principal of the School of Social Work at McGill. And she was the stereotype of the English social worker transformed into or transported to Canada. And she asked me a lot of questions and questioned my age, because by that time I was now 20, but I was graduating, and they didn't pick anyone in until they were 21. And we discussed different branches. And one of the questions I asked her was, what kinds of placements, what kinds of jobs? Well, it would be in a Jewish agency, because Montreal had 3 different federations. One was English Catholic, second was French Catholic, no, there were 4. A third was non-sectarian, which was Protestant, and the 4th was Jewish. And that's the way you went. I mean, you were eligible for services based on your mother's religious affiliation, and you worked in agencies, and there were no public agencies. So it's all private. That bothered me. I said, I'm never going to be able to work except in a Jewish agency. And the answer was, probably, unless things change. And I said, what about if I went into medical social work rather than general case work? Well, that would be different, although it might be in a Jewish hospital, but that they don't seem to be as worried about. So that might be possible. And that's when I determined I was going to be a medical social worker rather than generic social worker. I had a girlfriend at the time who was 3 months older than I, who was very bright. She was rejected because she was too young. I was accepted because I was a male. And I found that worked all the way through. In fact, the pattern then, not just at McGill but other schools of social work, was to recommend that all students should get psychoanalytic experience, go into psychoanalysis, because that they needed help. And routinely every person was referred, but not I or the other male students, because it was women who needed help, not men.
Kind of a reverse affirmative action.
Right. But it was a good experience. I really had a good experience. I ended up in a medical social work placement in my second year, and in venereal disease, and then in a venereal disease clinic. And this was 1941, and Canada was already in the war, had already been in the war for 2 years. I had been in the officer training corps in preparation for when I would graduate so that I could go into the Army as an officer. But when I graduated, the province of Quebec had a venereal disease control program, and there were very few trained people. So they put a lot of pressure on me to work for them, and not only to work for them, but not to enlist in the Army. And I said, but both for patriotic purposes, but also for selfish purposes, if I didn't enroll, at that time Canada had a volunteer army as well. It was a volunteer army. You could be conscripted, but you couldn't be sent overseas. But if you got conscripted, you went in as a private. And I said, I didn't want to do that. If I was going to go in, I wanted to go in as an officer. No problem. This is much more important to Canada than your being a private or even a lieutenant in Canadian terms, in the artillery. And so I allowed them to talk me out of it. And I worked in that field for, I guess it was a year. And then I got my notice of conscription. I went dutifully to the recruiting officer, and said, I'd like to go in the artillery. And I passed my exams in the officer training program. Oh, no, you can't do that. You go in as a private because you did not enlist, which was what I had thought. So that was all right. And they asked what branch I wanted to go into. At that time, you're allowed to do that. And I said I wanted to go into the artillery. So I felt at least I would have a chance to move up a little faster. And which they did. I went to basic training. I got a call. I was summoned back to headquarters, the recruiting headquarters, and was yelled at for not enlisting in the medical corps because I had all this experience in medicine, medical social work.
How soon was this after your...
This was like about 2 months later.
Uh-huh.
I was still in basic training. And I said, no, please do me a favor. Allow me to stay. I don't want to push bedpans. I'd heard the stories about the Army, about being in the medical corps because I had the experience, but then being an orderly. And they said, well, okay. But in the meantime, I found that I was suddenly giving courses to the other recruits on venereal disease, etc., etc. Then got summoned to headquarters in Ottawa. Lieutenant Colonel Williams was the man in charge of the venereal disease control program for all the armed forces in Canada, and in fact for the civilian, federal civilian program as well. And he said, we need you here. And I said, please just leave me alone. Let me stay in the artillery. But I was shifted to Ottawa, where I spent the rest of the war in the venereal disease control program. But in charge of, but this was one time when I got talked into doing what I should have been doing, and against my will. And I was in charge of epidemiology, and it was a fascinating experience because I could track where all the infections came from. I mean, where the bulk of them came from, and you could tell where the problem spots were, where prostitution was most rampant, and where it wasn't, or where the civilians took action, they were able to cut down on the incidence of venereal disease in the army. Our biggest problem was in Quebec, province of Quebec, and Montreal particularly, where they had open prostitution, although not legal, but open and controlled. In return for agreeing to be raided every so often, have so many people found in, and therefore paying fines for these, which was an elaborate way of bribing, they could stay in business. And they did. And we went in, the colonel and I and one other person, to meet with the mayor of Montreal and the head of the health department and so on, to see about cleaning it up. The mayor of Montreal was an old-style political boss, and Mayor Curley and all those traditions, who had tremendous power, but he pretended he couldn't do anything. And trotted all the usual kinds of things that you do about, do you want your sister raped? If we don't have prostitution, then this will happen. And we said no, that wasn't sufficient. But we didn't get anywhere. So we went to Quebec City and met with the cardinal, and said to the cardinal, we'd like you to do something about it. I'm a cleric. I can't do anything. Well, the Catholic Church had tremendous power in Quebec at that time. And we said, well, but you could tell your priest to announce that prostitution is evil, and work with the judges and convince them that they should do something about convicting the prostitutes or closing the prostitution houses down. They couldn't do that. And so the colonel said, well, that's too bad. What we'll have to do is to declare the whole of the province of Quebec out of bounds to the Canadian Army, which would mean a terrible loss of income. Within 1 month, the word went out to all the priests, word went out to all the judges from the cardinal. The houses were closed down, and the venereal disease rate in Quebec dropped. I mean, dramatically.
This then was an early experience in doing research and translating the results into social policy and action.
I mean, it really was a fascinating experience. So that's what I did for the first 2 years while I was in the Army. Then they formed a social service division, and I was transferred to that. I taught a course to the nurses, public health nurses, in venereal disease control across the country, half of them French-speaking, half English-speaking, taught one in French and one in English. And that was, I guess, several classes.
You grew up bilingual.
Yes. Although some of the venereal disease language I didn't learn in school. And some of the nurses, the French nurses, were a little offended by my language, but they got over it. But then I eventually did get a commission. I became a lieutenant and then a captain. And the social service division began, and with a focus on working with the families of the military, particularly in the demobilization period, starting in late 1944. And that also was a fascinating experience. I did some research first. There was a piece of research on military who had been court-martialed and what the experiences were in those detention places, which is all very vague in my mind now, but it was a 3-month intensive study which did influence policy. But then we moved into this other phase, and worked with the Red Cross as well as with the families and the military to try to reconcile families. But these were men who had enlisted in the war in 1939 1944, 5 years later, were coming back. They had enlisted, many of them, partly because there were marital problems. I mean, they had employment problems and marital problems, and they left. So you didn't have strong families, marital situations in the first place. Now, 5 years later, now the men came back expecting just to pick up where things had been left off. The women had built, what we found, had built their lives with the expectation their husbands wouldn't come back. This is how they could survive for 5 years. And when their husbands came back, it was like they didn't know what to do with them, because they become self-sufficient, and they didn't know these people, which was an interesting finding, because later on, I worked with a doctoral student here about 5 years ago, and working with wives of alcoholics, exactly the same situation, where they had learned to live with an alcoholic, but when the alcoholic became joined Alcoholics Anonymous or whatever and stopped drinking and changed personalities, they didn't know how to live with him, and they had to create problems. So there's a principle there, it seems to me, in that. But so that was the experience in the Army. When I enlisted in the Army, I knew I wanted to get a doctorate, and so the minute I knew I was going to be demobilized, I started writing to different places for admission. There were no no doctoral programs in Canada. And the only three that I knew about were Pittsburgh, Chicago, and I knew there was one at Bryn Mawr, but I didn't know very much about it. And I inquired primarily at Pittsburgh and Chicago. Columbia didn't have a program yet. And Pittsburgh said I could, with my experience, that I probably could finish in a year, at most 2 years. Chicago said, we don't admit anybody directly into the doctoral program. You can take courses, and then at some point you take qualifying examinations, and then you'll know whether or not you're going to make it. And we can't predict how long it will be. I chose Chicago. It seemed to me to be a little bit more, the standards might be higher, and spent 3 years there.
Maury, you were married by this time?
Yes, and married in 1945, actually a year before I left the Army, 9 months before. And I could go into stories about the immigration policy, but that's for another time. But Rita worked while I was going to school. We lived in veterans' GI housing, and everybody was in exactly Everybody was in exactly the same position, so economic position. So it was a nice compatible kind of arrangement. But and then she worked at the University of Chicago for the director of public relations, man by the name of Morgenstern, who wrote all the speeches for Hutchins and all the hate letter and answered all the hate correspondence, because there was a communist campus, because we had people like Paul Douglas and the head of the former governor of Puerto Rico, Rex Tugwell, and a number of other people like that. And it was a very exciting period, as you know, because you came right after there. And then when I came time to look for a teaching position, beginning in 1948, there were a couple of positions in Canada.
Excuse me a minute, Maury. Did your interest in teaching begin when you were starting to give these courses during the war period, or had you had that interest earlier?
No, I think it started with that experience.
Mm-hmm.
I never thought about that. I mean, I was a medical social worker.
That's what I was wondering
right.
about. Mm-hmm.
But that was what
so
I liked it.
The Army did quite a lot in shaping your career.
Oh, yes, they did.
Okay, I'm sorry to have interrupted.
Both in terms of the research as well as in terms of the teaching and the interest in policy. Because originally I was a clinician, but that kind of shaped. I mean, I could see what you could do if you could influence policy, and how important history. Just a side note on that, in terms of a lesson I've never forgotten. We used to quote statistics about the incidence and the prevalence of venereal disease, of syphilis particularly. 1 in 10 were going to get syphilis, and X percent were going to die of syphilis, of one form or another. And I got curious and like, where did we get that figure? How did we come up with it? And I couldn't find anything in the Canadian literature on that, or in the files. And then I asked a couple of people, and they said, well, we got that from the U.S. Public Health Service people. They've done some research. So during the court, while I was in the Army in that program, we met several times with our counterparts in the United States. And I met with a couple of them, and I asked them, I said, where did you get your figures? I mean, what's the basis? What's the source of the data? Oh, we got it from the Canadian Army. And we were, and then I realized a lot of public health estimates are of that nature. So that gave me a healthy disrespect for those kinds of figures. But anyway, back to looking for a job. I had 2 offers in Canada. One was at McGill, which had a great appeal. It was home. It was close to where Rita grew up as well. And the job I was looking for. But when I asked about the possibility of tenure eventually, because McGill had a history of discrimination against Jews in both in admissions of students as well as in hiring of faculty, I was told that as of then the policies were still the same. Hopefully they would change. Well, I didn't want to sit around waiting for hopefully. So I applied to several places in the United States, and there was a possibility of this position at USC. I checked it out with Helen Wright, who was the dean, and she said, it was a 1-year appointment, she said 1 year at USC will be under Arlien Johnson, will be worth 4 years anyplace else. Take it. And besides, you never know. I mean, they could develop into a longer period. And I had no interest in coming to California, and certainly by this time we had a 12-month-old child. The idea of traipsing across the country 1 year and then traipsing back across the country the next year didn't appeal to me, but we decided, well, we would try it. I was all of 29 years old, why not? And so we did. And when I arrived in Los Angeles, I met with the dean, Arlien Johnson, whose greeting was, Mr. Hamovitch, you realize this is a 1-year appointment. I want to be very clear. When Mr. Class comes back from his sabbatical at the University of Chicago, that's the end of your job. And I said, I'm well aware of that, but do you mind if I behave as though I were going to be here longer, because I need to teach the courses the way I feel they should be taught, and not just follow somebody else's outline, because who knows, that could go on for 2 or 3 years, and it'll be frustrating for me, and I think for the students also. And she said, fine, do it however you want to do it, but it's only for 1 year. So that was my start. And I was prepared to hate this Mr. Class, whom I met briefly just before he went off to the University of Chicago. Seemed like a pleasant person, an older man. He was all of 44, I guess, at the time, but at that time.
But he always looked older.
That's right. And so I couldn't get much of an idea. But he was very generous in sharing with me his notes, his plans, and so on, which were very helpful. But
you were going to teach the social welfare courses.
I taught all the social policy courses, first semester, second semester, fourth semester, the first year research courses, and the second year research courses, and was responsible for all the theses. I mean, I assigned them to different faculty to be on committees, but I was kind of overall in charge. Now, we only had 50 or 60 second-year students and about 60 or 70 first-year students.
And not many faculty.
But not many faculty. I taught 4 courses per semester for at least 5 years. So I have a little difficulty when people complain about more than 2 courses a semester. But it was exciting. And at the end of that year, I was renewed. I was appointed as a lecturer because it was a temporary position, and I was reappointed the next year for 1 more year. And then in the middle of the year, we were thinking about having a second child, and I went to Arlien Johnson and said, "I'd like to know what my chances of staying on. Is there any possibility of getting into a tenure track position? I'm not pushing, I just want to know so I can plan my life." And she thought about it and she said, "No, we'll appoint you as an assistant professor." Dean had a tremendous amount of power in those days.
And the school was not as dependent on soft money.
Didn't have any soft money at the time, I believe.
The university was supporting the school.
Right. But all she had to do was to go to the Robenheimer, who was the Vice President for Academic Affairs, or directly to the Chancellor, who was von Kleinschmidt. And von Kleinschmidt, by this time, was Chancellor. The President was Fagg. But
he might just as well not have been here.
But that's how decisions were made about personnel. The Dean and the Academic Vice President got together, or the President, and made the decision, which is very different from today. I'm not sure where you want me to...
Well, no, I think go right ahead.
All right, well, when I arrived, I knew I was on a 10-month appointment, and I was being paid in 10 monthly installments, the munificent sum of $4,000 per year. And that was 1949, which was different from 1989, but it still wasn't very much money. And we had no credit because as a student, the only credit I had was with the milkman and the telephone company. The utilities were paid for by the university. And so when we tried to buy furniture, couldn't get any credit. But finally I was able to get them. Barker Brothers said since I was working at the university, they would trust me, but I would have to pay it back within a year, which we did. But there was no money for the summer. We couldn't to live on. And so Arlene put me in touch with Jen Carter, who was running the research department at the Welfare Planning Council, and agreed to take me on, I think just as a charitable gesture, because we hadn't decided what it was that she would use me for, but that she would find something for me to do during those 2 months. And that's when I met Al Feldman. Mm-hmm. And then he introduced me to you, and they told me that you were planning to go to Chicago, so we'd like to get together and talk about it and so on. And that's where the friendship started, was in that way. And that was a lifelong friendship, which I value very strongly. And
one of my memories is when you came to Chicago to take your oral
Oh, that's right.
exam.
Oh, that's right. That's right. You were there then, and as a matter of fact, I went right from the orals to your house.
Those veterans'
house in quotation marks, and had a drink, and you both calmed me down. And then I guess I was scheduled to go over to Alton Linford's for something, because he was chairman of my was chairman of my dissertation committee. No, he wasn't. He was on the committee.
He was on the committee.
But he was he dean by?
Oh, Helen Wright was,
she was
still
still
dean, but he was really the person handling all the doctoral students.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But yes, so I remember that very vividly. And so that first summer, I worked with Jen and Elizabeth
Frank,
right.
the mother of our present Postmaster General. Anthony
Really?
Frank is her son.
I didn't know that. Oh. And her daughter was a graduate of our school.
Yeah, no, not her daughter.
Her daughter-in-law, that's right, her daughter-in-law.
Anthony's son, wife.
Yeah, that's right, her daughter-in-law. I didn't realize that. Oh. But what was, apart from the personal relationships, what was, for me, very rewarding about the beginning of that association was I wasn't then just in the research department, but Al introduced me to a lot of other people, and you then, in terms of some of the positions you held in the Welfare Planning Council, chairing committees and so on, brought me in touch with a lot of other people, including Doxson, Bob Doxson, and who was that one who was research for one of the insurance companies? Man with an accent.
Pacific Mutual.
Samuel? No.
I can't think of his name.
But I became acquainted with people doing research in business, but with social consciences, mm-hmm. which was very nice. And also, you were helpful. Both you and Al were helpful in introducing me to some of the key people in the public welfare scene, like Jim Barr and
Art
Will, right?
Uh-huh.
And who was the first CEO that who before Art Will took over?
Before Art Will, Thompson, Rex Thompson. Yes, Rex Thompson, and then Campion.
Yeah.
And then Campion was the military replacement for General Allen.
Oh. No, then I guess I just knew about them.
Art Will,
but Art Will
Campion,
right.
I think, who was more of a social-minded
person. And the Social Security office people. And I made a point of really spending that first couple of years going out and visit all the public welfare type of agencies, and some of the private ones as well, to get some sense of the community of social work, which was really very helpful over the years. And I wish some of the younger faculty would have opportunities to do that now, but our emphases are different. But it was certainly very helpful in teaching social work. I find a tremendous difference in terms of what current students know or don't know compared to the students at that point. And it's not just a matter of chronology. I mean, clearly, current students aren't going to know anything, aren't going to have had any personal experiences in the Civilian Conservation Corps or the National Youth Administration programs or WPA, as our earlier students did in the late 40s, early 50s. So that in teaching the history of social welfare, you always had students who themselves experienced those programs, mm-hmm. which made things much more alive than just recalling something from the dead past. But I noticed that even programs like the War on Poverty programs, there are very few students who have had any direct acquaintance with those programs as recipients. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there hasn't been an awful lot since the War on Poverty in the way of innovative programs, so that there's not much that they can tie into, which I think accounts for, to some extent, in some instances, for students seeing social policy courses as more academic than substantive. Although I must say that that's changing. I think I'm finding students are much more involved now and excited about social policy issues than was true 7-8 years ago.
And they have more opportunity now to do something about it.
Right. And and some of the issues affect them personally because in their professional lives, issues, policies like the Tarasov decision, which says that therapists must warn potential victims of their clients' intentions. Those kinds of things make them aware that it's not just an academic subject, it's not just something that policy people have to be concerned about, but as clinicians, they will be directly affected by the policies that are enunciated. So that helps. A little bit about who some of the people were on the faculty when I first came here. So the key people were Arlien, Ruby Inlow, Harley Trecker, John Milner, Maury Klass, Rose Green, Sue Wagner was in charge of field work. But that was
Betty
and Betty Payne.
Betty.
Well, that was a pretty impressive group of people, and it was a little awesome because I really was literally the kid on the block. I was, as I said, 29 when I first came here, and everyone else looked like they had to be at least in their ancient 40s. But they were very cordial and very open, which made it a lot easier. Harley Trecker was the only one who had children who were anywhere near, who were not already adolescent or post-adolescent. He wasn't there very long. He stayed about, I guess, 2 years after I first arrived. And then in 1951, he asked for a raise as a full professor to $6,000, and was told by the vice president that if money was that important to him, that much money was that important to him, he should go elsewhere, which he did as the dean of the School of Social Work, University of Connecticut.
I hope he got more than 6,000.
And he got more than 6,000. I think he got 6,500. But it was interesting in that period. I think where else to go now? Where to go next?
Why don't you tell us a little about Arlien Johnson's belief that faculty had to be involved in the community because you were demonstrating that.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting just to describe my image of Arlien. She was, as I mentioned, that the culture at the time was that the dean made decisions for the school, including personnel decisions, including by and large curriculum decisions, although she didn't, when I say that didn't mean that she didn't involve faculty. But the culture was that in the final analysis she could make whatever decision she wanted to. And people respected that. But she very much believed in involving faculty in decision making. And she wanted to hear from faculty. She very much believed in being involved in the community, in the public welfare sector of social work, and the importance of students having at least 1 year's field experience in a public agency. And she herself was involved in the community in a number of different ways, and insisted that the faculty also become involved. I think an indication of her tolerance for difference, however, despite this image I'm giving of a pretty strong person, is we had John Milner and Rose Green on the faculty at the same time. The one was a confirmed diagnostician, another confirmed Ronchian, and a functionalist. And yet they got along well. They disagreed with each other vehemently in terms of their positions, in terms of practice. theory. But that didn't interfere with their relationships. And I think that was something that she was able to instill in the faculty, that it was okay to differ, and to differ strongly on theoretical grounds or on philosophical grounds, but to have respect for each other. I think that was, and even today, not as much as then, but even today there is that respect for each other. And I can recall faculty meetings where there were, loud voices and strong positions taken, but then we would all go to lunch together, and not just simply burying it, but recognizing that we differed, and we still, but that didn't mean the other person was less of a person for that. She also was strong. She had strong opinions and expressed them, and would disagree with faculty as well if they voiced other opinions than her own. But she had no tolerance for people who couldn't speak up for themselves. And one situation, several situations which come to my mind, one had to do with the strike of the Jewish Federation agencies in 1951, was it? It was somewhere around that. Early on after I arrived, so it was either 51 or 52. And that was a very bitter strike. I had witnessed the strike at Chicago before I left in 48, I believe it was, which was also a very bitter strike. And the whole community was split in terms of, is there a place for unions in social work? And some taking position that was unprofessional, including Arlien Johnson, just felt that unions did not belong in social work. And some of the rest of us who felt differently. But it was not discussed openly in faculty. And although Arlene would make comments, but nobody would pick up on them. And I'd only been there, as I said, 2 years. And Arlene, on one occasion, asked me, what was my opinion about it? Well, I was young. I didn't know better. So I told her what I thought, and I said, I thought the Federation was wrong, that unions, that they should bargain with the unions. The unions had a place. I saw what happened in Chicago. And as if we teach about the rights of workers and so on, then we should practice the same principles. I'm not saying it should be the same kind of a union as a blue-collar union or a craft union, but there's a place for that. And I'll never forget what she said at the time. She said, I respect you for having that opinion. I cannot abide some of the faculty who don't have the guts to tell me what they think. I know what they're thinking, but they're spineless if they won't confront me with their opinions.
This was the old-time social reformer talking.
Right. And that was true. And I remember later on it stood me in good stead when I was dean, and there was we had a young faculty member who was not doing any talking in faculty meetings, and I could tell that he was having some difficulty. That he didn't agree with all of the things. And I talked to him at one point, and he said, yeah, I do. I said, well, why don't you speak up? Because I'm intimidated by some of the senior faculty members. And I don't want to jeopardize my chances of getting promoted when it comes to tenure. And I said, the surest way to fulfill that prophecy, that you're not going to get promoted, is to do exactly what you're doing, is not to talk up and not to express. Because when it comes to the faculty discussing your promotion, they're going to say, he never talks up, he doesn't have any ideas. We want a leader. We don't want somebody who's just going to sit there and say nothing all the time. He said, but what if they disagree? And I said, so they'll yell at you. But they'll respect you if you stand up. And he did. And then I noticed he did. And he came back and says, you're right. He said, so and so. I think it was you on one occasion. He quoted and said, I knew she didn't believe this. I mean, what I was saying, but I swallowed hard, and I thought, okay, I'll do what you told me to do. And afterwards, she came up to me, and after we were having lunch, and said, you know, I admire you, and whatever. I forget the detail. I forget what the incident was even, but it was, you know, you bailed me out. You proved me right. That it was true. But that's something that Arlien Johnson, I think, did convey to the faculty. Another incident I think that came out was, are we approaching?
Well, we still have them.
An issue around admissions records. When I first came here, the admissions sheet had religion, nationality, color, had all those items on and plus a picture. Mm-hmm. And I raised the question at one point in the faculty meeting about why did we have those? And the answer was, well, because it's very helpful in terms of placement, to get an idea about the people and the whole thing. I said, but we could be, term racist wasn't in the picture.
We're approaching the end, and I think I will turn this cassette over to the other side so that we can be of the interview with Dr. Hamovitch. And we will simply continue at this point.
Well, just to pick up where we were, I was just starting to talk about another incident with indicating the way Arlien Johnson, her deanship, and how she saw herself. The question had to do with admissions forms, and I had raised the question in the faculty meeting about items such as color, religion, ethnic, national origin, and so on, and was told this is for purposes of placement in field placements. I raised the question, but shouldn't we recognize that having these items on the form would be seen by people who saw us as biased, as practicing discrimination against people of color or people of different religions, because USC had that reputation as a university, and wouldn't apply. And that might account for why we had so few people from minority populations. And I was jumped on by Arlien and said, we are not prejudiced, we have never been prejudiced, we have always been open, etc., etc., etc. I said, I don't doubt that, I'm not questioning that. But I'm questioning in terms of the impact of how we set the form up. And other faculty came, to my point of view as well, and we discussed it very fully.
Maury, was this a form that had been developed here, or was it a pretty national?
It was a pretty national. It was a standard form. It was just taken. We took a standard form and used it. Mm-hmm. It was used in all schools, probably in all universities, and no one had questioned it before. Excuse me. And other faculty kind of came to the same position I did. And when it became clear there was a consensus that we should do something and that really we could change the admissions form and still then get that information later in terms of fieldwork placement. And Arlien said, okay, if that's the judgment of the faculty, we'll change it. And we did. And then we went after the issue of, all right, why do we need these pictures and so on in terms of placement of students? Well, again, the issue of it would comfort that you don't want to put a black student in an agency where they don't serve black clients, or they don't. Of course, at that point we were talking about Negro clients, Negroes, and where there are no workers who are black. And it wouldn't be fair to the student to be in that kind of an environment. And some of us said, well, maybe we shouldn't use those agencies if that's the case, if that's the way they see their function. Well, we didn't resolve that we wouldn't at all, but at least the point was made, and the practice then did shift, and we did begin to look at placements and begin to talk with agencies about why aren't you, or why, or would you, and would have and begin to influence the practice in the agencies in terms of the selection for field work, because agencies were coming to us rather than we going to agencies for students. Therefore, we were in a driver's seat in terms of helping to set policy in those agencies, and we did, and we began to do that. So I'm pointing that out as an illustration of the kind of person that Arlien was, that she in some ways was traditionalist and would, didn't think about certain issues and would argue the point, but then would listen to reason and certainly would listen to consensus and follow that, which is a wonderful administrative style to provide leadership, at the same time responding to not just looking for people who are willing to say yes, but responding to consensus and willing to shift positions where the consensus seemed to indicate a different position than her own, which I think was characteristic of her. But she was a powerful person. It took me a long time before I could call her Arlien.
Well, she was an intimidating person.
And there are people who, to this day, not to this day, she died a couple of years ago, but who never could address her as anything but Dean Johnson. And I recall Jim Peterson, who's retired now, who headed up the sociology of the family program. When he came to campus and to want to develop that program in sociology, came to talk to Arlien and asked her blessing. And she said, there is no place for a program like this on this campus. We have a school of social work, and I will fight it. And was very short with him. But I worked with him on some research years later, and he recalled that and said she was absolutely right. If I had been in her position, I would have done exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. Now, it turns out that the university is big enough that we could have both programs, but she set me straight in certain terms, he said, and I've heard that from other people. But she also had a lot of respect. So those were some of the things about the faculty and Arlien. Nori class, I'd like to go back to that. My first year of skepticism, more than skepticism, really prepared to be paranoid about what this person was going to do, because my livelihood, my job depended on him, on his coming back kind of thing. But again, I think characteristic of the faculty that Arlien recruited, when he came back, he asked me what I had done with the course for advice on how to change the course. He didn't say, okay, now, did you follow my outline, and now let's go back to it, but treated me as an equal. And that had a tremendous impact on me, that here was this very senior faculty member who was clearly an expert, clearly a scholar, clearly respected by students, asking, this young punk coming out as to how did you do it, and maybe we can work together on doing it differently than I've done it in the past. And that, I think, also carried through in terms of the to some extent, the uniqueness of the people teaching policy on this faculty over the years. When you joined the faculty, 1953, was it?
54.
54. And then the three of us were teaching social policy, and then later it was you and Nori. But the three of us taught for a long time. It was a collegial kind of thing. And I think from the minute you joined the faculty, as I recall, we made some changes also, because you brought in the fact about, wait, we should get beyond the beginning of the Depression at the end of the first semester, kind of thing, which was very hard to do. But Norrie at least agreed with it, and allowed
and tried
and allowed that was our goal, and therefore was okay for you and I to do that. Although you were better at it than I was, because I had more of the University of Chicago tradition, even though you were there 3 years, wasn't it? But I think that has carried through in that sense. 1953 was another landmark kind of year. That was when we decided to have a doctoral program, and typically, Arlien thought about it. She met with, I think it was Norrie and I, and one other person I think met with her. We decided, maybe Helen Northern, that we would have a doctoral program. And then we decided what kind of a doctoral program it would be. And we decided it would be a DSW rather than a PhD. We knew we could get either one through the university. But we wanted the DSW because we wanted it to be a social work degree. And the purpose of the degree was to prepare people to go into academic positions. Therefore, if everybody was going to be teaching in a school, every graduate was going to be teaching in the School of Social Work, didn't matter what the degree title was, the quality of the degree was what would differentiate it. That was the primary reason for the DSW. The secondary reason, was that if it was a DSW, the school would have control over the degree, which meant we didn't have to have a foreign language requirement, and we saw no point to that. And also would give us more flexibility in terms of how we set up the program. So we opted for the DSW rather than the PhD. And I think it was in the second of the early classes, so I recall.
Because he got his master's in 59.
Is that right? Oh, that's right. No. So it wasn't. No, so he wasn't that early. I'm sorry.
No, he was a little
wasn't
later.
early. Chauncey Alexander was in the first class, and Chuck McCann was in the first class. During that period, then, in that earlier period, you came on the faculty, Lola Selby came on the faculty, Edith Tufts came on the faculty, Helen Northern came on the faculty, and Mary Lou Summers came at the same time I did, and Lisa McBroom. She and Lisa and I joined the faculty at the same time.
By the time I came, Mary Lou had gone.
Left, yes. Now, one of the mistakes that Arlien made, that was part of her rigidity, unfortunately, that was the one mistake that I can point to, was when Mary Lou decided that she would like to get her doctorate, and she asked for a leave of absence for 2 years to go to University of Pennsylvania to work on her doctorate. And Arlien said, you either leave or you stay. And it was a terrible wrench for Mary Lou, because she loved it here. And some of us, I guess nobody dared to really question Arlien on that one. Some of us felt bad about it. But she was adamant. That was the policy that she had, and that was it. And it tied in with something else, because there was a point, I remember, 1955, 56, somewhere around there, maybe a little bit later, where she made a comment to me about the faculty not having enough gumption, that nobody left the school. We came and we didn't leave, and it was, and it was really a dig at me, because I'd had offers to go elsewhere, after I established something of a reputation, once I became a full professor. But each time I'd think about it and think, but nothing is going to be better than this. Why leave something I love to go for something else just for the sake of making a move? But her idea was that if you're ambitious, you leave, and you become restless. You want to see another program or whatever. And I think that was
really what she had done.
That's right. That's right. Although she stayed here 20 years as dean of the school.
Yes.
But that was, and she might say that was in her senior years. But that's when you're young, you should get up. You shouldn't be satisfied to stay someplace. And so I think it tied in with that. I mean, that was appropriate. And I guess it related to her notion about child rearing, that you prepare children to become independent, and you let them go. In fact, you encourage them to go. And she thought, and she saw this as her family. And I guess that's, as I'm thinking about it now out loud, that may account for that position that she had.
I think that's probably quite right, because in so many ways she really dealt with us as our parents.
Well, think about the way she treated Norrie Class and John Milner. They really were her sons.
That's right. I think it
and they responded.
Difficult. Yes, they responded, but at the same time, yes,
of course, more back to more personal kinds of things. In the early period, in the early 1950s, interest in research led me in a number of directions, not so much in terms of, well, let me put it differently. In two ways. One was through the student research, through the theses. I developed a whole series of theses dealing with the impact of illness on family members. Most of the research which had been done, still today, most of the research which has been done, is on the impact of an illness on the patient and the impact of the family on the patient's recovery. I was more interested in looking at the impact of having a patient who was ill with diabetes or heart or whatever, and how does a family respond to that? How does a wife respond to that? How do the children respond to that? So I had a series of studies of physical illnesses, of emotional illnesses, of mentally ill people, of retarded, what it's like, and developed a whole series of studies of that kind. Those were very exciting, very interesting to me. At the same time, I was approached by different agencies like the Veterans Administration and a couple of other agencies to provide research consultation to their staff to help them become involved in doing research. I did it for two reasons. One, because I believed in it. I thought that we could do something. Second, because it paid, and I needed the money in a sense. It was a form of supplemental income. One experience I had with the Veterans Administration, which led to some notions I had in terms of how you do of consultation, of people who provide mental consultation as social workers. They asked me to provide this to provide this consultation service to them, this training program. And I asked them how much they would pay. They said they would pay $25 a day. And I said, is that a standard rate? Well, they pay psychologists $50 a day and physicians, psychiatrists, but social workers $25. And I said, but I have a PhD, the same as the psychologists. And even if I didn't have a PhD, I have as much knowledge. You're asking me to do the same thing you're asking a psychologist to do, and you're asking me to do it because you think I could do it better as a social worker, working with social workers. Well, that's the policy. There's nothing they could do about it. And I said, well, in that case, I will do it for nothing, but I will not do it for $25 a day. And they said, well, I'm sorry, we can't do anything about it. The next year they called me back and asked, and went through the same procedure. Only this time, they discovered a loophole which was that since I had a PhD, then I could qualify. I said, okay, I will do it, but I'm still under protest because I think that's unfair. That if I had a DSW, I would still have expected to get that. I wouldn't do it for less than the others are getting. And I think that's a principle that's very important that social workers often miss, that we underrate ourselves and we undersell ourselves, and therefore we perpetuate a stereotype that we're somehow less worthy, less important than others.
Or that's part of our profession to give.
Right. And as I said, but there's an answer, and that is to give. But make it clear that you're giving and not being paid.
And you're in control
right.
of them.
And I used that when I taught the course in consultation. I would make that point. If you're going to provide consultation, either do it for nothing or do it for something that's what you know you are worth. Unless it's an agency that can't and doesn't pay, pays everybody else on that basis.
But they're not discriminating.
But they're not discriminating against social workers. Mm-hmm. So I did quite a bit of that, which led to then eventually becoming consultant nationally to the VA for people who were in research jobs to help them improve their skills. And I feel very good. There are 3 or 4 of faculty members currently, well, one is retired as a matter of fact, but currently in very important, very key positions who, in a sense, graduated from that as a result of, I think, in part as a result of my involvement with them, went on to get doctorates and then into academia. One is Gene Giovanoni at UCLA, who's now assistant provost or vice president. Lou Carr at Howard University, and there's another one who's on the University of Georgia that I know about, and I think there are 2 others that I lost track of. And that was an exciting period because that brought me into the national scene, and I felt and in each of these endeavors, it brings credit to the university, to the school, I think, to have someone from this faculty being called on to provide those kinds of services, like John Milner, like Noe Class have done in other aspects of social work. In 1956, Honora Wilson, City of Hope, asked me if I would come out and provide some consultation to them about a program that they had that they would like to do some research about. And that was a program where in their children with leukemia, they had a parent participation program where parents were invited to stay with the children while they were hospitalized and help in the care of their children so they would get more involved and not be quite so isolated. And this was a time when leukemia was invariably fatal. No child survived more than 2 or 3 years. And at first it sounded like what they wanted was a study to prove that it was a terrific program. I said I couldn't do that. But I'd be willing to think about doing a study that would look at what the impact was on the parents. Now, it might come out, if they were right, then it would come out that the results were very positive, and it's something that should be duplicated elsewhere. But it could be that it would come out negatively. And they said, okay, and I met with the chief pediatrician, the chief of this clinic, Al Knutson, who was had both an MD and a PhD in biochemistry. Very, very bright person, very sensitive person. And we got along very well from the beginning. And this was just something I was going to do for them. But I said I couldn't do it until after I came back. I had just received notice I was going to be getting the first National Institute of Mental Health Senior Stipend Award. This was a new program to pay academics, primarily in the social sciences, their salaries to go anywhere they wanted to and study mental health so they could have a mental health as component. Well, I didn't point out to them that I was already a mental health professional. They wanted to consider me a social scientist. That was okay, and I did receive the very first one, and the terms were that I was going to go to Harvard University School of Public Health with Gerald Kaplan, who was pioneering a whole new approach to mental health consultation. And he was their fair-haired boy at the time in any case, so that my having picked that, I mean, it was just a shoo-in. And I said when I got back from there, then I'd be willing to set up that research. In the meantime, I met with, forget the name of the person, a psychologist who was Herman Feifel, who had been who had done as much research on death and dying as anyone, and he was interested in this clinic as well as for death of dying of children. And I tried to get some information from him as to what he was doing. I said, look, let's get together because there's no sense in our duplicating each other. No, he didn't want to meet with me. So I told Knudsen about it. Knudsen said, you tell him that if he doesn't meet with you, he cannot set foot on these premises any longer. He does not have access to our cases. Well, with that, he met with me. And he was a nice person. But he said, the reason I didn't want to meet with you is because I've had experiences. I mean, it's well-known fact that in psychology that you meet with somebody and then they're going to steal your instruments and publish before you do, and you never get published and you don't get promoted. I said, I thought, these paranoid psychologists. I said, that's stupid. Why would I want to do that? I'll share. Here's what I'm planning to do. All I want to be sure is we don't look for the same things. And so finally he agreed. But when he heard I was going to see Gerald Kaplan, he said, but you have to promise me you will not say one word about this to any of those people at Harvard. Because I know them. They'll steal me by. Oh, I thought, okay, he's crazy. I got there, and that's exactly what the whole climate was. You hold on to what you have.
You just weren't used to it here.
Right. And what I was told these were very strong people. They've gone on for outstanding national reputations. Tom Plout, who still is, has a very high post in the National Institute of Mental Health. An anthropologist and a sociologist, both have made outstanding names for themselves. So you're not talking about poorly trained people, but they were all convinced that Gerald Kaplan was stealing them blind, that we have these meetings to talk about the project that we were working on. And they were afraid to open their mouths because they said what he did was he would take notes, and then the next thing they knew, he had an article out based on their findings. And so I believed that, and I could see the kind of person he was. Now I got along with him. We had a great time, and he was very complimentary and gave me all kinds of opportunities to do consultation and then he invited me to do a piece of research with him. And they said, don't do it. By that time, I'd been notified. This was early 1958, that I was being promoted to full professor. So I said, look, it doesn't matter. I mean, I don't need it. The publication, but it looks like it's going to be a fun thing to do. And he promised he would do some of the legwork. So his name goes first. Doesn't matter to me. I mean, his name is Kaplan with a C. My name is Hamovitch, so it's Gerald Kaplan, and it could even be seen as that we did it alphabetically, so I'm not worried about it. Well, we didn't get involved in the study, and he did an awful lot of the legwork. I wrote up the first draft of the report, and I said, how would you like to have it, authorship? He said, well, you've done it. It's Hamovitch and Kaplan. I said, but C comes before H, and you've done a lot. He said, but the creative things and all the rest, it's yours. And then later, we became good friends. And later I did share with him some of what I'd been told. He said, he said, the thing is, I've been pushing them and pushing them and pushing them to publish, and they wouldn't do it. And that data those data were getting stale.
Mm-hmm. So he'd step in.
So he stepped in and did something with them, so quite the ogre that he was made out to be. But that
well, I
really,
guess there's a lesson in that. You have to look more carefully at what's under some of these statements.
Right. And then it was interesting when I came back. Well, that was a fascinating year because I sat in on some courses at the Harvard School of Public Health. I sat in on a course with Schlesinger on the main campus on history, intellectual history of America, which was fascinating. I spent a day a week doing mental health consultation. And I met with, I was invited to give talks and get involved in some workshops, both by the Federal Maternal and Child Health Program people through Elizabeth Rice, who was on the faculty of Harvard School of Public Health. And it was a very ego-boosting kind of experience. Came back, and just because I had been there, I was Mr. Mental Health Consultation in Los Angeles to everybody, which was, didn't make sense, but nobody else had been touched by Gerald Kaplan.
Mm-hmm.
But it really almost had nothing to do with what I knew, with the fact that I had been there. For example, Harry Brickman, we talked about him, and who was the head of the mental health department at the time when I came back, was about to launch a mental health consultation program. And the irony was that he picked my brains and then proceeded to say, would I provide consultation to the people he was going to be hiring as consultants, mental health consultants. They all were psychiatrists, psychoanalytically trained psychiatrists, no social workers. And I thought, this is irony. This is really ironical. He's hiring a social worker to train psychiatrists to do mental health consultation, but won't hire any social workers to do the mental health consultation because they don't have the knowledge or whatever. Now, eventually that changed, but he really was a strange man. But that was kind of a fun experience also. And then at the same time, I did pick up with the City of Hope again on that project, and I decided that to do it right, we really needed some money. So I decided to apply for an Hamovitch Research Grant. I did all the right things. I checked to see who was on the committee that would review it. I found there were mostly psychologists and sociologists. There were no social workers, and a couple of psychiatrists. And I thought, okay, I'd better write this so that it's statistically very sound and very theoretical, so they don't say this is a soft-headed social worker doing some inexact research on a very sensitive subject. And what do you expect? I mean, they really don't know research. So I wrote it very carefully. It was turned down. It was turned down because it was too antiseptic. Here was this person who didn't know anything about people and didn't care about people, didn't recognize that this was...
That's really the irony.
And the staff people on NIMH, whom I knew, said, but he's not that way. I mean, we know him. We've worked with him on this, because they did. I consulted with them, and I said, well, that's not the way it comes through. So then I hired a statistical consultant, a sociologist. What's his name? Schneiderman. Ed Schneidman.
Oh, Ed Schneidman.
The suicide prevention.
Yes, Ed Schneidman.
Yeah. And I said to him, I'm going to pay you I want you to help me out. Here's the situation. And here's what the criticism was. But I still want to make sure it's statistically sound. He said, well, I'll be glad to do it. I said, I want to pay you for it. He said, no, you don't have to. I said, oh, yes, I do. If I pay you, you're going to give me your expertise. If I don't pay you, you're going to slough it off and say, well, that's pretty good. And so he said, okay. And he did. He was brutally honest. Some of it was very good. Some of it I didn't take, didn't accept. And I rewrote it, and we got funded. We got funded for 3 years, and that was a really excellent experience. And then at the end, I did the same thing with one Francis Feldman. I said, I need an editor to go through this, but I want to pay you, and I want to pay you for your time, and you tell me what it's going to be, and I will put the money aside for that. And it came out, and it was very well received. I still get inquiries about that book. And that was back in 1964.
Yeah, but the dynamics involved have not changed.
Mm-hmm. But so that was. And that was something I felt very good about and very important. I had been asked to serve as dean in places, and I didn't want to. Well, I didn't want to, period, because I was not interested in becoming a dean. But also, I felt I couldn't become a dean, even if I'd wanted to at some point, until I had satisfied myself that I had done some definitive research. Not just that I'd been a good consultant for other people or a good teacher of research or written some articles, but that I would. And I believe, and I really feel that was very important. And I've seen people take on deanships without having done that and really suffering as a result. Just in terms of their own self-image. How can you expect other people to do research if you haven't done it yourself? Or how can you expect other people to become involved in ways that you haven't, that if you haven't done it? That was another very good experience. Out of that also, I was appointed to the National Institute of Mental Health Review Committee. And for 4 years I was on that committee. And we passed on, hundreds of proposals. And that was a very important learning experience. It was a challenge. It was very, very difficult. It was it was a tremendous amount of work. We weren't paid for it, except a per diem, a modest per diem, I think $50 a day by this time. I was going to say it wasn't much. But somebody figured out one time that we were being paid at the rate of 76.5 cents an hour. But we didn't do it, obviously, for the money. And just the challenge of, what was rewarding was the challenge of having all these scholars reviewing the same documents as you, and then comparing where you came out and where they came out, and the persuasiveness of your arguments versus others in terms of whether we approved or disapproved these projects. And so that was, I guess, part of being a Sagittarian, of the competition and the challenge that goes with that. And also while I was back east, I began as a member of the National Executive Committee of the Social Work Research Group. People like Henry Moss, Anne Shine, on that committee. And that was another very challenging, exciting experience, comparing notes with other people from not all social workers. One person whose name I can't remember. Wait a minute. Doesn't matter. Who was a psychologist rather than a social worker. But at that time, there weren't all that many social work researchers. So anybody like Jen Carter was a member of that. She wasn't a member of that committee, but she was very active in the social work research group. That takes us kind of to 1965 1964, I guess it was, 63 or 64, when I took a leave of absence from the school to finish the document at the City of Hope. And while I was on leave, Topping asked me if I would serve on a committee to think about establishing a gerontology center.
And he was our president
at
the university then.
And So a group of us met, and we agreed that this would be good to have, but we stipulated that it was going to be a center, it was going to be a kind of a research center, but also some training. We're trying to get some doctoral training money, that it would be interdisciplinary, but it would offer no courses, but would try to influence other departments like sociology, social work, psychology, education, physical education, I guess were the ones we were thinking about to start with, rather than offering courses. And as the first interim director for 1 year until they found a permanent director. So here I was finishing a study on children who were terminally ill, and moving into gerontology to the other end of the age spectrum.
But that was pretty prophetic, wasn't it?
It was. It was. And there were, when this, I guess 1964, I did this the night, and there was some money. We had some money from Ross Cortese, who was building all these leisure worlds. Mm-hmm. And so I got some money to do a first study with Jim Peterson on how these people who moved into the leisure world liked it. Mm-hmm. Leisure world, yeah. And that was one of the first studies of its kind. That summer, they appointed Jim Bieran to be the new director. Jim Peterson left, so that first summer I was interim director for 3 months in between the two of them. And then I stayed on as the kind of associate director for education, so that the training programs, summer programs and so on, were my responsibility to develop. Mm-hmm. And the students we had on grants, I kind of followed their careers and helped advise them in terms of their programs, in whichever discipline they were. And the first graduates, very first graduate was Barbara Solomon from our school. Mm-hmm. And I think 3 of the first 5 graduates were social workers. So that established us as having quality students.
Mm-hmm. Now, by this time, Arlien Johnson had retired.
Right. Arlien retired in 1959, and Malcolm Stinson came on in 1959. He had been recommended by Helen Wright. He had worked with her in India. And his style was very different from Arlene's. Arlien was very much involved in every aspect of the school's program. Malcolm liked to delegate and to let other people carry the responsibility, which he did freely, but not. He didn't object to people actually taking on those assignments and following through on them. He really believed it. It wasn't a question of giving, but then watching and criticizing. And he had a very laid-back kind of administrative style. But he never objected to other people taking the initiative and encouraged it, which was a good trait. Mm-hmm. So there was more freedom than under Arlien, a sense of you could innovate more without having to go through certain hoops under Malcolm than under Arlien. Mm-hmm. Now, if I were asked for an honest comparison of the styles, I would say I'd prefer Arlien Johnson's style, because Malcolm's worked in part because he inherited Arlene's faculty.
There was already a foundation.
Right. It's a little bit like football coaches. I mean, football coach inherits a good team that's been recruited by someone else. He looks good, but he may be a poor coach, but the athletes have learned how to work together and how to win. And I think that was true to some extent in Malcolm's case. I think Malcolm was highly underrated in terms of his intellectual capacity. because of his laid-back approach and manner, people didn't think of him as being very bright. But I had discussions with him. I had discussions with him with doctoral students in terms of dissertations, where he was so sharp, he could penetrate. He really was a very good thinker. He really was a good analyst. But had a problem with confrontation. In contrast to Arlien, he had a problem with confrontation. And so he would get personally hurt when people confronted him or disagreed with him seriously. And that created some problems. And yet, under his deanship, a lot of very important things happened. The generic curriculum was developed at this school, the first in the country, under Malcolm Stinson. Now, he may or may not have come up with the idea. I don't recall how it originated. You probably remember better than I.
Well, I think it's faculty discussion, looking at what was common among some of these courses and why were we repeating.
Oh, right.
I
know. And wait a minute. And I know the actual precipitant was Guido Pinamonti, was my doctoral student, and he did a dissertation on the use of groups by caseworkers, and found that they felt they had no background in it, even though there was a required course in group work. And they would go elsewhere for courses in group therapy rather than group dynamics, rather than to the School of Social Work, where we had some renowned people teaching group work, like Helen Northern. And I guess I brought it back, and maybe Malcolm picked it up and then brought it to faculty for discussion.
And at the same time, Helen was doing some work out at Metropolitan State Hospital.
That's right.
And was very sensitive to the fact that knowledge about individual human behavior had to be incorporated in work with groups, and the other way around too. You had to understand group dynamics in order to work with the individual. So I think all of these converged.
Right. But he gave, full opportunity for it to be developed and worked hard at help and assisting, I think, in making it happen. And so that's a tribute to what happened under his deanship. Later on, he was dean from 59 to 67. 68, he went on, 67, 68, he went on sabbatical. And he asked me to fill in as acting dean for him. And I warned him that, as I had done with Arlien Johnson 20 years earlier, that if I was going to be acting dean, I would act as dean, and I might make some decisions he didn't like. He said that was fine. Well, one of the first things that happened was that Chauncey Alexander approached me and said, what about setting up a support group? Would I be willing? He had talked with Malcolm several times, and Malcolm agreed but didn't follow through. Would I be willing to work with him in establishing one before Malcolm got back? So it would be an established fact. Not that Malcolm was
Number 2.
Agreed. And on that committee, that first committee was Chauncey, Al Feldman, Helen Olander,
John
Pixley, and there was one other person, I believe. It was a small committee.
John insists that I was on it, but I don't remember it. I don't think so.
No, Al was on it.
It was Al.
Yeah. And, well, I remember because Al was very vocal very instrumental throughout the thing. Kind of some reality, bringing us back to reality every so often when John...
Interview with Dr. Hamovitch from Side B, cassette number 1.
Where should we start on the...
Well, why don't you start with Chauncey approaching you?
Well, Chauncey approached me with the idea of starting a support group for the school. We didn't have a name for it at the time. And the original members of that committee were Al Feldman, John Pixley, Helen Olander, one other person I don't recall. Now, it turns out that the ones who actually originated the idea were Al Feldman and John Pixley, and it approached Chauncey to move it along, which he did, and did very effectively, but did not acknowledge the fact that it originated with the other two. But it did get started, and it was called we decided to call it Los Amigos de Humanidad, with the Spanish flavor given the area, the region that we live in. And that program is still going on. But the other thing that was going on at the time was this was the period of the student activism, the period of the strong civil rights movement, with all kinds of requests from minority populations, both among students as well as in the community. And it was a period of strident demands, and stridency was the key word, or the key food. That students didn't ask or didn't request, they demanded, and sometimes used four-letter language where other language would have done just as well, if not better. And it could be offensive.
We weren't used to such
That's right, which was something which was not something we had been used to, and some of the faculty members were offended and a little bit resentful of having to respond to that kind of approach. But we agreed that the important thing was to look at the validity of their requests rather than the form of the requests. And this, again, is typical of our faculty, which was unique, which was very different from other faculties of other schools, most other schools of social work. While we felt we were under fire, we were dealing with pussycats compared to everybody else in relation to the way in which we dealt with it. And I attributed that then, and I attributed it now to the willingness of faculty, to the security of faculty in dealing with students, in the validity of our program, and the readiness to make some modifications, that we were always looking for modifications where we thought they could improve the program. So that later on, deans of other schools of social work would turn to me when I later became dean in my own right, that what kind of students do we have that they are so complimentary about the school and the faculty when everybody else's students were condemning the faculty and condemning the administration.
Or striking, yes.
And were striking in some cases. But, and as I said, I attributed it always to the fact that the faculty were ready to respond. I'll give you an illustration of that, and that was it was during that year, where I guess it was the following year, but students had come in sometime, I guess it must have been April, this was when graduation was in June, and first-year students, and said they would like to make some modifications in the curriculum in the second-year curriculum. And we discussed it, and I said, well, it made some sense. It's something that we would give some thought, and we would discuss it next year. Well, they said, we can't wait till next year. We only have one more year here. I said, well, forget it. There's no way that we can do that. It takes time. Things don't just happen. Well, why? It's just a matter of changing this, that, and the other thing. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, it probably could, you're right, it probably could be done, but if the faculty were ready, were willing to make the accommodations, and administratively it would be difficult, but I could probably work it out. But then we'd have to find out from the faculty. Well, could I take it to the faculty now rather than later? I said, well, okay, I would do that. And I did, and the faculty listened and said, that's something we've been talking about for some time. Why not? Can you handle it administratively? We're willing to do it. And it was done. Now, that's the kind of thing that why the students responded so positively. was the fact that the faculty were willing to listen to reason. And they were also appreciative of the fact that the faculty were also not willing to cave in and whatever they wanted to give them, because then that they realized would reduce the quality of the program, that they were not in a position to make all those decisions. So when the faculty would say, no, we think this is wrong, that's what we said. And we never got an argument. We got arguments, but they never struck, they never did anything of those things. Years later, they asked for example, some of the minority groups were asking for quota system, and we should have 25, 10, or something like that distribution of minority populations, black, Hispanic, and Asian. And the faculty and I agreed completely that we would never do that. UCLA, the dean said the same thing, but the faculty did not back him up, nor did the administration, and he eventually left under protest, the deanship, because he had been undermined. Students still, and the community groups still picketed UCLA every year, and didn't USC.
They didn't meet the quota.
What's that?
They didn't meet the quota.
Right. Or that was too low. No, they met the quota. Just that they felt that their attitude was wrong, or whatever. I mean, they always found some incident. Mm-hmm. What we had agreed on was that we would that any qualified minority person we would accept. If a minority person who was turned down said that he or she had been unfairly treated, if that person were willing to release their names and release the information, sign the thing, then that would be discussed with the community group, and they could look at it. And if they found any evidence that in fact there was discrimination, that these people were in fact qualified, then they'd have cause for argument, and we would take it from there. But that we felt that they would never find such an instance. The next year, there was a situation where a black student had applied with something like a 2.3 grade point average in her senior years, in her upper division years. Her father was a professor in a medical school, had been for a long time, long before the civil rights movement, so it wasn't because of his blackness. Her mother was a medical technician. One brother was in law school. Here was she with a 2.3 grade point average. Now, either she wasn't too bright, which happens. Sometimes you get one child who's very bright and one who isn't, or she was lazy. But in either case, her grades were not a reflection of discrimination or of disadvantage. And the group said, you're absolutely right. And that was the one and only case that was challenged. That did it. Years later, one of the groups was again picketing UCLA, and I had kind of screwed up my courage and said, explain something to me. All these years, we have never had a quota. We have set up these kinds of things. We have failed students, and yet you've never picketed us. And UCLA has had a quota system, has met its quota, exceeded its quotas, has changed programs, and still you're picketing them. What is it? I'm not looking for trouble, but what is it? Because we know that the school, the administration, and the faculty are committed to the idea of affirmative action, have demonstrated their commitment to it, but not at the risk of lowering standards. They've demonstrated they can do it and not lower standards. UCLA, it's a political game. They don't believe it. Mm-hmm. And so we have to keep the pressure on constantly. And I think that is the difference. And as I said, and that's why I go back to Arlien Johnson in terms of the quality of the faculty that she hired and that she instilled, and that I go back to her idea about an administrator has a right and a responsibility to lead and to be forceful, but a faculty has a responsibility to be equally forceful and to argue back and to take positions and to be professionally responsible. And that's the kind of people we've had for the most part over the years. And I think that's what saved us during that whole period. Now, the other excitement of that period, of course, were all those retreats we had in which students really berated us and so on. And those were primarily ventilation episodes, I think, more than anything else. But they at least gave the students a recognition that the faculty were willing, that we were willing to expose ourselves to this and to respond and to try to listen to them, but still to emerge with whatever position we had, which they then had to abide by. And so I think we played out.
Yes, I think, Maury, it really was a testimony to the quality of leadership that you brought. Leadership based on understanding dynamics of human behavior and how people behave under something. But you applied that, and that's what these students were getting.
But they were, yeah, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate your saying that. But it could not possibly have worked if it weren't for the faculty.
No, it had to be a team effort,
yeah.
Certainly.
And a unity, and that's what was missing at Berkeley, where the faculty, in fact, conspired with the students to oppose the administration, to oppose the rest of the faculty. Because they were looking for their own, and I think it's a reflection, and I realize I shouldn't be putting this on this kind of a tape.
Well, that's all right. You'll have a chance to edit if ever we're able to transcribe.
You're right. But I think it reflected that culture of a faculty that did its own research and didn't communicate much with each other. And therefore it was perfectly appropriate then for a faculty member who believed in this kind of community social action of encouraging the students to, without thinking about the rest of the school. And I think if anything if anything makes us somewhat unique among schools, is that basically there is this commitment to the school apart from a concern about one's own advancement, which I hope we'll see continue.
Pretty much a basic principle in what we try to teach people who want to become social workers.
Right.
How you work
but
with
not always
others.
It's not always carried out.
No.
So that was that period. Well, I jumped ahead of myself a little bit because what happened, I started to say that Malcolm, when he during that year, these things were going on. When he came back, he found that he couldn't contend with that change in climate, and he just announced to me one day. He said, "Okay, the school is yours. You take over as of July or whatever." I said, "Malcolm, you can't. I mean, it's not your school to give in the first place. It's the faculty has to make that decision, and the university administration has to make that decision. And besides, I don't want to be a dean. It's like you're assuming I want to be a dean. I don't. I like what I'm doing. That's why I haven't taken these other jobs." And he said, "Well, what about these other? He said, do you want somebody like, name some names, come over and take over this school? You've got a lot invested in this school." And that did get to me. And I went home that night and talked to Rita, my wife, and I said, Malcolm, I told her the story, the conversation. I said, "What do you think?" And she said, "Well, do you want to or don't you want to?" I said, "Well, not really. I don't really want to, but I feel maybe I should, and I think the faculty would like me to." And she said, "That's the worst reason for you to take the job. If that's why you're going to do it, those are the reasons, forget it. You'll be a big failure. You'll hate it." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because the first time somebody says, some faculty member crosses you, you say, 'But I'm doing it for you. I'm not. I'm only this because you asked me to.' But either you want to do it, in which case you're going to do something with it, or you don't want to do it. If you don't want to do it, don't." And so then I had to be honest with myself. I said, "Well, I kind of would like to see. I mean, there's some thing. I mean, I've got a taste of it, and I'd really like to see what could be done.
Well, you knew what you'd be getting.
That's right, because I had the experience. Yes. And I said, but the first time I lose a night's sleep, I'm going to announce my retirement from the job. And through all that period, I never did lose a night's sleep, because I was able to. Because I was confident, I guess, in the faculty that things would be okay. But anyway, so Malcolm gave up the position, and
I think it's important to note that the faculty was unanimous in voting.
Well, and you were.
Yes,
you
I
chaired,
was
you
chair.
chaired that committee.
And I remember when Paul Hadley, who was the academic.
No, it was Tracy Strevey.
Yes, Strevey, and then the man who went to Hawaii, the chemist.
Yeah.
And they met with the faculty and said, are you doing this just because it's just easier and you don't want to look? I don't think you were in that meeting.
Oh, no. I said I said I wouldn't be in that meeting.
Yeah, it was just the faculty, and as chair of the committee, I was the one who had to lead the discussion. And they wanted to know whether this was the easiest way to handle a transition. And we said no. We had polled all the faculty. There was not a single dissent, but only enthusiasm. They said they hadn't had that experience elsewhere in the university, and I remember that we all laughed and thought that was funny because we said there is no other school of social work in the university, and Strevey said, well, that's it. That's what they would recommend to the president.
Mm-hmm.
So that, and I think the fact that this was unanimous, enthusiastic support is very important.
Well, I guess it was, certainly was in terms of making it possible to.
You weren't in the meeting.
No, I mean, I didn't recall hearing about it, but I do. But events. Well, that year, Norman Topping was the president, and I did meet with him. And I knew enough about administrative and organizational theory to know that this was the time of my maximum leverage. And so I pointed out that, in fact, I was taking a cut in salary, in net income, by taking the position, which was all right. Mm-hmm. But I needed 3 new positions, university-paid positions, in order to develop the program adequately. And he said, okay. So and also he asked me about whether I wanted an associate dean or not, and I said, no, in this period, given this period, to have someone between me and the faculty or between me and the students, I think would be a big mistake. But what I would like is an administrative assistant who can take on a lot of chores, and that I will feel some responsibility for, but I really shouldn't be doing myself, and yet not as a gatekeeper. And so he said, okay, and that's when we hired Lenora Blauman. And I hired her. She's bright, and I didn't know what the job would entail, and I told her that. And I said it'd be increasing responsibilities probably if it worked out. If it didn't work out, there'd be decreasing responsibilities to the point of not being around. And for me, she was a perfect person. I mean, she had lots of flaws, but for me, it was good to have someone like that.
She was able to do the things you needed.
Mm-hmm. And so that was the period. And then, of course, we did spend a lot of time trying to educate ourselves about ethnic minority content, cultural differences. We tried a couple of things. We tried to have a special course on working with minority groups. We discovered very quickly at the end, before the semester was half over, that was not the way to go, because the ethnic groups themselves were saying to us, wait a minute, how can you teach all about working with Hispanic people in 2 sessions or 3 sessions or even 4 sessions? That there are a lot of differences among us as well. And certainly when we came to the Asian populations, that came out very clearly. And so more discussion among ourselves and with outside groups, we agreed that what we would try to do is to infuse the content throughout the curriculum. And that we've been trying to do more or less effectively over the years. Sometimes less than others, sometimes more than others. And I think it's still a problem because there's so much of it that it's hard to get it in. And I notice that there's a resurgence of the notion there should be a special course. And I think it was wrong. I thought it was wrong then.
Well, I think it's a cyclical thing.
Right,
It will
right.
always keep coming back.
But but feeling that at least then you know someplace it's done. But by knowing someplace it's done, it takes the burden off others and makes it even less incumbent, or feeling less incumbent on other faculty to teach it. It's like not having anyone except social policy people teach social policy, even make any reference to social policy. Mm-hmm. And the practice theory teachers point out the policy implications of practice, or the practice implications of some policies, then it begins to work better. Policy people know how to integrate practice and policy. Not all practice people know how to do that. And that's on the record. Other things that went on during that.
Etched in the model.
Yes.
Doctoral.
Right. The doctoral program went through a number of refinements. And it was activated, so it'll stop when I stop. And there's something came. When I first became dean, there were a number of undergraduate programs developing, and there was a big movement to have an undergraduate degree which was which would become an accredited first move into the profession, and then, in a sense, have a 1-year master's degree beyond the baccalaureate for those who had this BSW degree. And I remember being invited to give a speech at McGill University on curriculum building, and I took a very strong position opposed to that whole notion of a BSW degree. And then 2 years later, I found myself coming back to the faculty and saying, but maybe we should try it. And faculty agreed to at least try it for a 5-year period. And then we would assess it before the end of the 5 years as to whether we should continue it or not. And so we set it in motion, and in our accreditation review, the only criticism we received was that it was too good a program. It looked too much like a first-year master's program, and that in fact that was kind of a violation of the concept that graduates should be able to go out and practice immediately with a degree. That we were socializing them to the notion that to be real social workers, it was a 2-year degree program, starting with the BSW and then on into the second year of the masters. We did admitted some students from the baccalaureate into the master's degree. We did a study, and second-year faculty members, put that differently, faculty members teaching second-year courses were not aware of who were the baccalaureate people and who were the non-baccalaureate people, so that the performance seemed to be okay. But still, the nagging comment kept coming out from faculty teaching the courses that the students were too young. They didn't have enough life experience to respond, to even ask questions. John Miller said, who's an excellent teacher who believed in the undergraduate program, said that he taught the whole course in the first 3 weeks. Because there were no discussion. That he had to then move on to other things and try to manufacture issues for them to discuss that they could discuss. He said, and the problem is that they're behaving just exactly the way they should behave. They're behaving like adolescents, and they are adolescents. And then we began to notice some problems in the field. In the second-year field placements, there were some problems. But all in all, the more we worked with it, the less happy we were with it. And probably the first and only program where we started that we stopped. No, that's not quite true. We have had a couple of others. But we then voted that it should go out of existence, and we phased it out.
But on the basis of knowledge of...
Right. Mm-hmm. And so that, I think, that was a noble experiment, truly a noble experiment in the sense that we were willing to say no on the basis of our experience.
And brought somebody in to operate it, Bob Roberts.
Yes, we gave it every opportunity, and we really brought in someone, a senior faculty member, to run it. Barbara Solomon taught in it. John Milner taught it. It wasn't that we were assigning junior faculty to it. We had senior faculty teaching the courses, and faculty who were committed to it, who really believed in it. And then we decided not to. Another program that we started was what we called a satellite program for students in Orange County and in Riverside and San Bernardino counties. We set one up in Orange County, one in the other. And that we did in response to demand from those communities, but after several years we found that there was decreasing response. We had a third program. These were all evening programs, part-time evening programs. We had one also on the main campus, because what we found was we weren't getting very many minority students from these other areas. And the minority student population said, what about addressing the needs of the minority students for a part-time program? So we established it, and we did have far more minority students in the main campus program. But the other ones, the true satellite ones, we found decreasing applications because we had educated the group that was out there that was looking for this, who were primarily people working in public assistance, public welfare agencies. And we terminated them, but kept the part-time program on-campus program, both daytime and part-time evening program. And people did come from the other areas, but there weren't enough to warrant a class. We stopped that sometime in the middle 70s. Well, then in the 1980s, we found that Orange County, where there was a demand for for social work education, and Long Beach State was setting up a program. And so Dean Roberts came to the faculty and asked us if we would be willing to establish a program call it a tri-county program, stationed in Orange County, but accessible to Riverside and San Bernardino counties. And what he heard from the community was that there was a lot of anger against USC because we had started a program when it suited us and stopped it when it didn't suit us. No one bothered to mention that there weren't any takers for the program, and that's why we stopped. It wasn't that we suddenly decided we didn't need it any longer. But we did learn from that experience, and I think the program currently is a better program. It's more realistic and is more likely to continue than the other one, because we're now talking about an expanding population rather than a population of social workers who are in place, who are looking to be trained. We're talking about people who might be coming, who in other times came to USC, but now might not come to USC since there's a Long Beach State.
But there, I think, is another element that probably makes for a difference now, and that is that the university itself began to move into Orange County, right. Where they had not given that kind of support.
That's true. Before. That's true, and therefore there's a USC presence.
Yes.
And a lot of alumni, USC alumni, who live in Orange County. I think the other is that we have a full-time administrator for that program, which makes a difference. Yeah. So she's out there recruiting, whereas in the previous situation, we waited for people to apply. We didn't bother going out to recruit because we were responding to request, whereas now we established the request, we established the program. So I think that's working out fine. Things on the period during my deanship.
In your administration to emphasize research more.
Yes.
This is when we started the
Right.
Social Welfare Research Institute.
Oh, right. That's right. Early on, with your help, we set up the Social Welfare Research Institute with social rehab funding. Jen Carter had told us about it, and when we received the funds, we decided to recruit her.
And she had been the researcher
right.
At that federal department.
So we asked her to head up that institute, and that developed into some very fine research that was conducted, including one study of the attitudes of the attitudes of the general population about welfare recipients. And contrary to all the newspaper articles and some of the other research which people had presumably done, what that institute found was that there was an overwhelmingly positive feeling on the part of the population for public assistance programs and for expansion rather than on the programs. And your project came out of that.
The Alaska Project.
The Alaska Project was kind of an offshoot.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it wasn't directly under that, but it was related. It was separate funding.
But one of the other things that the Research Institute was involved in was a national university.
Oh, yes.
And we had an important role in that, but it did more. Our role was more than really carrying out our part of the training, national training. But I think a healthy respect was developed among people in these other schools for what we were teaching here. And it showed up repeatedly in the written documents that we saw.
Yes, and there were some very good documents that came out of that project. And a couple of good conferences which we hosted for the Western region schools, to which our current dean came.
Yes.
And I think may be one of the things that, he hadn't had much contact with us, with our work, and he could see some of the things that we were doing. And I think he was impressed.
Well, and actually, we, early in your tenure as dean.
Okay, that's the other one. I guess I mixed the two of them up. That's right. That was the project that we had, right?
Yeah, and he worked
Yes.
on that. He was already at Washington.
Yes.
But we worked collaboratively, and out of that project, we developed the CO administration. I was involved
That's
in that.
right. And then I neglected to talk about our relationships. And the other thing we developed during my tenure as dean were the joint degree and the dual degree programs.
Yes, I was
One with the Gerontology Center. That was very early on, and we asked Al. if we recruited Al for them because he was on their payroll to head up the training program, and included in that was the dual degree program for the School of Social Work and Gerontology, and it was out of that he then began he was one of the first to teach that course on community practice. Community organization and administration is what we called the course. And that was a baptism of fire for all the people who taught that course, including Al. But he stuck it out, and he came back for more, and then we began to get good reviews. But it was hard because here we were adding a course the students during a period when the students were beginning to think, becoming very clinically oriented, private practice oriented. Why did they need another policy course? They all saw it as a policy course. They still talk about it as a policy course. But it isn't. It's a practice course. It's a community practice course. But that's right. But Al headed up that program. And under his tenure, while he was heading up that dual degree program, we had excellent field placements for the students, quality placements. After he gave up that position, after he retired, Betty Hartford took it on, and she tried to maintain those, but it was the beginning of a losing battle. And I think currently the field faculty have a lot of reservations about the quality of the second-year field placements that those students are getting. And we don't have too much control over that at this point. I think that's something that bears some examination.
Yeah, but I think it ties back to something you mentioned before on an earlier cassette about the fact that faculty under Arlien were imbued with the idea of being a part of what was going on in the community and knowing the agencies, your own visit to all the agencies. That was Al's philosophy too. And I think that's what gave strength to that. But that decreased over the years. And I think this lack of direct, constant involvement really helps to have the placements at a lower level than they were.
Although I think in terms of the ones that we have control over, where we make the decisions, the field coordinators do that. But here's one where we don't have control over.
We don't stimulate them.
Right. And it's interesting, of course, that the person who heads it up is a graduate of ours in the master's program, but a doctorate in another field. And they just see things differently. It's hard. But the other dual degree program, but while Al was heading up the program, it really was a quality program. And I'm not saying it's not a quality program now, but it's different. But it's different. The other one, major one, was with the Hebrew Union College, and that one also the second year placements are determined by the other component, and there have been some problems, but I think that's somewhat more under control at this point. And that's it's about the same kind of relationship between the two components of the program. So those are two viable ongoing programs. There are smaller programs, with the School of Public Administration, but every year we have 2 or 3 students who enroll in that. And that's one where we have complete control of the field placements, as well as largely in terms of the coursework. The coursework is more extra than substitute. There are just a couple of substitute courses. School of Law, we have one with the School of Law, which was initiated at their initiative, as was the one in the School of Public Administration. That one has not been. We've had an occasional student, maybe 3 altogether, and but it's on the books, and it's there for people who want it. And we have, I think, one with urban and regional planning. I'm not positive, but that wasn't a formal program. I think it just kind of evolved.
Now, Maury, was it during your deanship that our relationships with the medical school strengthened?
Oh, yes.
And we had joint teaching.
That's right. Well, that was, we was with your friend, Dean, the tall man who went to HEW.
Oh, Eggeberg.
Roger Eggeberg. Roger Eggeberg was the one who initiated, and again, I had some relationships earlier with Bob Tranquata, and at the time, Bob, I think, was running the County USC Medical Center, and Roger Eggeberg was the dean, and he came to us and said, what about having a joint appointment? We need a social worker on our faculty. Would you help us find one? But we insist that this person should have a joint appointment, must qualify on our counts and on your count, and must teach courses in the School of Social Work as well as with us. And so we did, explore, and we came up with Elspeth Kahn's name, and they interviewed her, and they were enamored with her, and our faculty reviewed her, and she was appointed, and then subsequently was reappointed and required tenure. And she did teach for us for quite a while. She has not taught the last 7 or 8 years, I believe, because of the demand on her time there.
Program there.
But that did bring us very close. They did get much more closely together. And it carried on into his successor to some extent, but he wasn't quite as keen on it. But there were a number of occasions where we were able to have some joint projects, including a couple of research projects.
But his successor, Alan Mathias, whom I saw yesterday at a meeting, the first thing he said to me, he's now a whole set of programs, and he said, I certainly learned a lot of respect for social work through the School of Social Work and our joint. And I was surprised because he made a point of that, and it has given him a respect for the social work staff at the hospital.
Oh, that's
and
nice to hear. That's good to hear.
He attributes it to his experience here.
That's good to hear. Well,
and that I was a hard taskmaster as a mistress, as president of the President's Advisory Council. He didn't know that social workers had gumption. And I heard this yesterday too.
Oh, that's great.
But he tied Elspeth and his respect for her with the school's role.
Oh, that's great. So there are those programs. Well, in 1979, I decided that I didn't want to end my career as an administrator. I started as a teacher and researcher, and I wanted to continue wanted to end that way, and do it while I was still young enough that I could do it without people saying he got tired of the deanship and so he's retiring to becoming a faculty member. And so I did that. And again, you were chair of the committee to recruit the new dean, and Bob Roberts was appointed, and I think that was a good choice. And I did exactly. I was fortunate that Kathy L., who was a new faculty member whom I had hired, and one of my last hirings, was starting a project and asked me if I would be willing to work with her and the other person, Joanne Mantell. And I said that's exactly what I had, the kind of thing I had in mind. And so I did get involved. And so this last 10 years, I thought it would be 5 years, but it turned out to be 10 years, have been just very rewarding. And I've done what I said I wanted to do. And I'm glad I did it. Now, the two just postscripts I'd like to add that I thought about over the course of the years that I was involved in that in relation to social welfare in the community. One is the Frida Moore Center at Jewish Family Service.
Hold on a minute, because we're coming to the end of this cassette, and I'm going to have you start that subject on a new one.
What time is it?
This cassette will continue on side B of the Hamovitch interview. Continuation of the interview with Maurice Hamovitch on cassette number 2 from side A.
Or would you rather start with the other way?
No, this is fine.
One on the Frida Moore Center at Jewish Family Service, when, and also Honora Wilson, I wanted to make a comment about some of the people I had met in my earlier explorations and then had contacts with over a period of years, were some of the pioneer-type women in social work, like Honora Wilson at City of Hope Medical Center, Frida Moore at Jewish Family Service, at Cedars, I guess it was Cedars Hospital, downtown Los Angeles, were the kind, and they were really kind of in the mold of Arlien Johnson. It was a whole generation of women in social work who had really provided not only leadership, but had really developed programs and were able to maintain them. Mm-hmm. And while they were involved, those programs were very good programs. After they left, they changed. Because the whole complexion of social work administration changed, so that there was a shift from women administrators to male administrators. A little bit of what I ran into in my entry into social work, I mentioned before. But Honora Wilson had developed the City of Hope Social Service Department to the point that it was the social conscience of the hospital. And I remember meeting with the medical administrator of the hospital, who would ask me advice on how to deal with Honora, because she's great, and but she's so demanding. I mean, she keeps pushing. I said, well, that's why you hired her, because you want someone who will do that. That's how you got this program. But can you talk to her? Well, I mean, it was that kind of thing that in some cases, a little bit beyond, their tactics weren't necessarily appropriate for that particular time. But they did make a real substantial contribution. And then with Frida Moore, when she retired, she asked me to, and I hadn't known her that well, but she asked me to meet with her. And she had a little bit of money, and she wanted to set up something in her memory at the agency. And she had been involved in the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, where people were coming in. And she said that was a walk-in. That was one of those things where it was a hands-on. It wasn't all this formal bureaucracy. I'd like something like that. And she said, what do you think about a walk-in clinic for elderly people on Fairfax? I said, I think that would be fabulous. And that's how I'm sure she talked to other people, but that was the development of that Frida Moore walk-in center for the elderly, which has become so big now.
That's right.
Well, that was just
it's a terrific model, actually.
Yes. And I'm surprised it hasn't been picked up in other ethnic communities.
I think on a limited scale, but without the verve that she put into it, and her staff, because it's a Chicano bank. But I think they're small scale, and they don't have the kind of support, professional as well as financial.
Right. See, because that was a small. There was not much money, and the agency didn't put much money into it. But then then Barbara Kaplan and Sandy King, and I guess who was before Barbara Kaplan? Maybe Barbara was the first one. They went out and got federal funds and local and community funds. They went out and
they were persuasive.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's what's lacking in some of these others. In this Dale Huntington Hospital, a number of models presented of efforts along this line, and I listened to them with great interest because the most successful were Frida Moore and the storefront centers they started in the Valley and a couple of other places. But I decided then there was something in the vitality of the people who started it and who kept it going that made the difference. That was an important influence you had.
Connected with the agency, so that I've been ever since I gave up the deanship, I've been on their board of directors, and it's kind of fun, and it's a whole different kind of board. It violates all kinds of principles of that we think of.
Because it's so personalized.
It's personalized. They are involved. The first meeting I attended, I was shocked. I was sitting next to Rama Wiseman, and they were getting into, almost into personnel matters. And I said, would you like me to say something? Or dare I say something? And she said, no, you need to attend a few meetings till you get a flavor of this board. It's a different kind of board than you're used to, but it works. And they really don't intrude, but they are very involved. And I've come to have a tremendous respect for those board members. These are bright, mostly women. It's half women and half men. But the women are not there because of their husband's money. They're there because they have things to contribute. They have ideas to contribute. And I think that is part of the vitality, that they really are involved. They come in knowing that they've got to make a substantial contribution to the agency. But that's like a given. They don't have to be persuaded to do that. Beyond that, then they're there to provide advice and decision-making and interceding on behalf of the agency and other circles, in community, in United Way meetings, in Jewish Federation budget hearings and so on. But not necessarily, they're not there just to lend their names or contribute money at key points. They're there for other reasons.
I was going to say tangible, but that makes it sound as though it's financial only.
Right. Now you were asking me about the university, the school and the university, and I think from the beginning, well, probably even from the beginning, under Arlene's predecessor, Bogardus, the school had a reputation. I mean, what's the word I want?
Well, it had status.
It had status. It had a reputation that this was an important part of the university. It wasn't just something that was added on. And it had an integral part to play within the university. And Bogardus had a place to play. I think Arlene was listened to both by von Kleinschmidt as well as Robenheimer, and I don't know about Fag, but there was respect. I guess that's the word. There was respect for the school, and for some of the faculty who were involved in other activities. I think later on, then your contribution is certainly added to it, both through your work with Hubbard and with the Trillium.
But you were responsible for that. Do you know how?
How?
Do you remember the first committee we had on insurance for faculty and staff? You were on it, you chaired it, and asked me to take over. While I had chaired other committees in the university, like student financial aid and so forth and so on, I dealt only with a very small number of people. But when the insurance committee became active, because the trustees were going to make $10 a month available for every employee, and we had set up a committee that cut across the board, not just faculty, but others. The reporting from that committee to the university senate and then to other groups in the university made social work very visible. And so I had a visibility that I would not have had with any of these other committees, though I must say I worked harder on some of them. So it was your turning that committee over to me that really propelled me into the limelight and therefore the school.
Yeah.
So you were responsible.
Well, but you had to do it. I mean, you had to do it the way you did it. But anyway, the thing is that I mean, over the years, I think there's been a continuation of input from from selected faculty members. Not a lot of our faculty are that involved in the general university operations, but you were. I mean, Ruby was when I think Betty Payne was for a while. Norrie and John in different ways with selected departments within the university.
Yes, primarily
like the juvenile delinquency and sociology. But so there has been an ongoing kind of
and Barbara.
And Barbara Solomon, right. But that really is it. But just enough. Then other people, as I said, like John and Norrie, were known in certain circles. Sam Taylor is known in public administration, urban and regional planning, even some parts of education. I think Kathy L. at this point is well known in a number of the research areas. So there is a visibility for the school, and in contrast with many other schools of social work, in key places, not just simply they know about us, but well, think about it. You were president of the faculty senate. You were you were chair of the president's advisory council. I was chair of the dean's council. Barbara Solomon is dean of the graduate school.
You had chairing roles on various significant committees through the university.
Yes, and I mean there was a point I know where I think you were chairing either the Senate or the President's Advisory Council, and I was chairing the Council of Deans, and people were saying the university is being run by social work. I mean, and there were deans who were really, truly envious, like, because both you and I, and Barbara, had direct contact with the president and with the academic vice president, in close relation, you more than any. And it did feel to a lot of people like we feel about some other parts of the university, that like the law school, that they have too much power or whatever. But that was how it was viewed at that point. And you're right. I mean, I did serve on a number of university-wide committees over the years, and I think that's important for a school, and I hope that we continue to, the school continues to recognize the value of that. I mean, it pays off in so many ways. For example, just as you're talking about the ones that you were on, but being on the University Appointment Promotion Tenure Committee for 2 terms as I was, gave me an insight into the way that committee operates, so that we have really never had a recommendation for promotion for tenure turned down. I mean, there was one we submitted where we in effect concurred, but we submitted a recommendation, but it was one that we couldn't defend, that we knew we wouldn't be able to defend. But any ones that we really felt strongly about were approved by the university-wide committee. And I think being in on the system helps. When I was I was on the graduate fellowship committee. We had 2 of our doctoral applicants got funding. I know they would not have been funded if I hadn't been on that committee. Chairing the graduate school curriculum committee for 2 terms made it. I mean, things that we had in mind just sailed through, changes in our programs. But apart from that, the visibility of the school has, I think, inestimable value in terms of the place of this. I mean, the acceptance, the receptivity to program changes that we ask for, or the dean asks for. And I hope that as I said, I hope we continue to do that.
I hope so too, because commission popping up so fast.
Well, and we talked about that when you and I were talking when we last met in the different roles, that the Faculty Staff Counseling Center. I mean, think about that. The bit of your efforts came out, and so you have a viable program which is run by the School of Social Work.
It would not have gotten started, though, if you hadn't been receptive, because it was in your
But we started.
that we started. and it could have been discouraging,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't.
Right.
But it also goes back
Mm-hmm.
through the School of Business in Arlien.
Yes.
You see, so there was a carry
Well,
over.
I think you're being too modest. It was because he had worked with you.
Well, I know, but we got started
Uh-huh.
during, and she was involved in the.
Well, she was involved, but
Yeah,
I mean, but I
yeah.
think, but it was.
But I think over the years, and to you, so because it has in the community, the Health
Mm-hmm.
Development Commission, and the training sessions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think your input into those did affect policy. Didn't last long because of the political situation, which affected the politicians in charge. For a while, you also were.
Well, in some ways, mainly through two things. One, I was a faculty liaison to a number of the mental health agencies, the VA Brentwood Metropolitan State Hospital, what used to be Pacific Colony, then Pacific State Hospital. What is it called now? I'm not sure.
Fairview?
No. I think it may still be Pacific State Hospital.
Maybe so.
It's in Pomona. And the other state hospital, Camarillo, not as much as Camarillo as Metropolitan State, and the one out near San Bernardino, and involved in student research projects, so that I came in contact with a number of those people and was able to. What was the name of the man who was headed up the Pacific State Hospital program? Went to UCLA, still there. Tarzan, right, and got to know him pretty well, and we carved out a place for social work. We developed. The program was there, but there were questions about it, and we did some research on it, and demonstrated the value of these home placement, these small group home placements of mentally retarded, and Tarzan really picked up on those and used those with the legislature in terms of getting funding, so that and the Metropolitan State Hospital in terms of the leave programs, and we did an experiment where we set up that they had to do their first interviews within 30 days instead of within 90 days, and we found that as a result, some people got back in the hospital sooner who belonged back in the hospital, but more people were able to stay out longer because there was activity earlier. They had picked up on it. Mm-hmm. And so that was helpful, that kind of. So there were those research projects which didn't get published, but they were used within the agencies. And I think that's something we sometimes don't recognize, the value of that kind of research, which is administrative research, which leads to policy modifications or support. Not all research needs to be published to be useful, I guess is what I'm saying. And yet, it was while I was dean that more and more we were pushing for the research responsibilities of faculty in terms of promotability. Now, part of that is the university culture changing. Even if we hadn't wanted to, we would have had to. But then and now, I believe that it's important for faculty to contribute to knowledge. And the way you do that is to do research and to publish it.
Mm-hmm. I think it's not possible to overestimate what the contribution to community social welfare programs and policy has been, because it's a matter of record.
I suppose I shouldn't, in my part of this at least, without making some comment about the research center. And that was when, I guess it was the last 5 years of my tenure as dean, the university began to require from deans what are their what are their development plans, or what are their development goals, and we had to prioritize what where we would place these different interests. And with consultation with faculty, I'd come up with the research center as a place. If we were going to require faculty to do research, then we had an obligation to provide the means to make it possible and to encourage it, including seed money for young faculty or for senior faculty to develop proposals which then could be funded. And so this was high on my priority list, but it was like a pie in the sky kind of notion. I would put it in without much expectation anything would happen. Two things happened in the last year of my tenure. One was the Los Amigos asked me what would I like if they would like to make a substantial donation to something in my honor. And I said, well, the one thing I'm really gunning for is the research center, so whatever could be done to that. But I knew that was, I'd say substantial, we're talking about maybe $10,000. But before that, Robert Sutro had said that he had, I forget quite how we got involved, but anyway, we did. And when he heard I was retiring, he said, I'd like to make a substantial contribution to the school. I'm going to be selling my business, I'm going to be making a lot of money, and I'd like to pledge $100,000 to the school in your name. You tell me, what would you like? I said, a research center. That would really be a great start. So that's how it got started. Well, he didn't come through with very much of it, although there's still hope that he might before the year is out. But with that, we had the opportunity of at least getting started. And then when Rita died, I added her name to it because she had worked with me a lot on some of the research I had done and was very involved in that. So we got more contributions. So that there's a fairly substantial amount of money now. And Philip Levin, his wife, when she was a student here, was yes. His wife, who was I guess she was a quadriplegic, had been so touched that we accepted her into the school that we kind of bonded. And I know and also you and she bonded, you and Jack Levin had close relationships, and they had offered the money for the scholarship for a handicapped person to the university. We were the only two who were invited, along with Jack Hubbard and his wife. And so they've made a substantial contribution also, which has made it possible, at least for something to get going. And that I feel very positive about.
Well, I think what's good. What I wanted to ask you is that when you look back over these 40...
it's more in global kinds of things, I guess. I don't know about specific incidents as such that are gratifying. But I think about why I never did leave, even though I had some attractive offers and was tempted at times. Not only in terms of, when I say attractive, I don't mean just simply in terms of monetary remuneration, but in terms of going back to my alma mater at Chicago, and they asked me several times, other places, was as I would look at what would I be giving up in return for what. I guess it's the collegiality of the faculty is one thing that stands out in my memory, all the way through, with some minor exceptions. And as I did a lot, I didn't mention my activities with regard to Council on Social Work Education. I was on the board of directors in several key commissions, and also did a lot of site visits for accreditation purposes. And each time I would go to one, including places like Columbia and Hunter and Michigan, so I'm not talking just about the smaller schools, Berkeley. what always stood out was the collegiality of the faculty. And when I say collegiality, I don't mean just nice people, but people who were of substance, who had the security of arguing with each other without getting overly contentious, or certainly without personalizing. And the lack of power seeking, ambitious and didn't want to have more, have responsibilities. But it wasn't power for the sake of power. And faculty wanted to be faculty; they didn't want to be administrators. So that the deans were all the deans. Faculty said, you take care of salary decisions. You take care of these other things. We don't want to do these. And I remember when I took that sabbatical in 1972, in the height of the activism, and I said, you've got to develop a what was the term we wanted? The governance structure system. And the best time to do is when I'm not around. And the hassles you had to get people to sit and really pay attention to this. And even then, when it came out, it was that the dean had veto power. And I said, wait a minute, shouldn't you put in something there about the fact that, but he has a response, or he or she has a response that must explain why the veto on a decision, not just simply, I veto it. Oh yeah, okay, then you can add that. And quickly, after we got going, people said, this is taking up too much time. Why do we have to go through these machinations? And I mean, that's a flavor, I think, that can only come from people who are secure with themselves and with the administration. So I think that's one overall impression I have of a good feeling. The second is just the opportunity to do the things I wanted to do. I mean, I've loved the teaching, I've loved the research, I've loved even committee assignments. Not only the assignments in the university, but the assignments within the school, and the assignments in the community. It reminds me of, you see stories not too often now about baseball players or football players who say, I enjoy this so much, I should be paying them rather than they paying me. Almost that kind of thing. And I've always had friends who had far more money than I did, but they all envied me because I would talk about what I was going to do and what was going on, not, oh, I gotta get up and go to work. And I just feel that I've been it's because of this place and the people. And that's what I'll miss.
Well, you'll miss it, and the school will miss you, except that you know it doesn't have to be a permanent separation.
No, I know that. And see, and that's the thing. I mean, I think I can still maintain relationships without having to. But it's been nice.
That's a good point.
Good.
On which to end. Maury, thank you.
Thank you
very much.
I haven't thought of these things. I mean, I really haven't until now.